The courtroom went so quiet the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. The judge took off her glasses. She leaned over the heavy oak bench, her eyes locked dead on my older sister. Then she asked one simple question. "Do you actually know who your sister really is?" Christina opened her mouth. Her jaw just hung there, completely frozen. The smug, entitled grin she had worn all morning melted into pure, stuttering panic. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Beside her, our mother clutched her designer purse, her knuckles completely white, refusing to look up from the floor. Just 10 minutes ago, they stood in front of this judge, wiping away fake tears, swearing under oath that I was severely mentally ill and needed to be locked in a psychiatric ward. They wanted total control over my $6,400,000 trust fund. They thought I was just a quiet, fragile target they could easily erase. They made a massive mistake. I am 29 years old, and my name is Jocelyn Evans. For the past 5 years, I have worked as a corporate compliance officer. My entire career revolves around one thing: I hunt down corporate liars. I track missing funds, expose executives who think they are untouchable, and dismantle fraud. I know exactly how toxic people hide their tracks, and I know exactly how they lie. My sister Christina never respected any of that. At 34, she was a startup founder whose entire personality was built on being the golden child. She loved expensive restaurants, flashy investor dinners, and the feeling of being the most important person in every single room. Our mother Erin treated Christina like absolute royalty. Mom valued her Charlotte Country Club image and her own comfort over everything else. She enabled Christina's worst behavior constantly, demanding I stay quiet and swallow my pride just to keep the peace. The real nightmare started on the first anniversary of our father's death. We were having a memorial dinner at my mother's house. I walked into the dining room and stopped dead in my tracks. My heart hammered against my ribs. Christina was sitting at the head of the table, sipping champagne. Wrapped around her wrist was my father's vintage silver watch. It was the only physical keepsake he had left directly to me. It was a heavy piece of metal that swallowed her thin wrist. She had sneaked into my apartment earlier that week and simply taken it. The air in the room grew so thin I could barely draw a breath. I walked straight up to her chair and told her to take it off. Christina rolled her eyes, let out a dramatic sigh, and unclasped the leather strap. Instead of handing it to me, she held it over the edge of the table. Then she opened her fingers. The heavy silver casing slammed against the hardwood floor. The glass face shattered into dozens of tiny pieces. A hard knot of grief lodged in my throat. I dropped to my knees, sweeping the sharp shards into my palm. Before I could even reach the metal dial, Christina's hand shot down. She grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked my head violently backward. Her perfectly manicured nails dug deep into my chin, forcing me to look up into her twisted, mocking face. She hissed that I was pathetic, a worthless shadow clinging to a dead man's trash. I wrenched my head away. She shoved me hard by the shoulders. I slammed rib first into the sharp edge of the glass coffee table. A blinding pain shot through my side, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. I gasped for air, clutching my ribs, waiting for someone to stop her. I looked up at my mother. Mom sat in her velvet armchair, completely still. She calmly picked up her crystal wine glass, took a slow sip, and turned her face away. She told me to stop making a scene. She claimed Christina just slipped and asked why I always had to act crazy and embarrass the family. A cold, sharp realization washed over me right then. They looked at me, curled up on the floor, and saw a helpless victim. They thought they had finally broken me, but they forgot what I do for a living. I gather evidence, I build a case, and I destroy the people who think they are above the rules. The psychological warfare started the very next morning. I walked into my apartment and immediately noticed the shift. The air smelled stale, completely violated. The blue sofa cushions were flipped to the wrong side. My laptop charger was coiled backward on the desk. I walked straight into the bathroom. The medicine cabinet hung wide open. My prescription anxiety medication, the pills I relied on since my father's funeral, was missing. I found the orange bottle buried at the bottom of the kitchen, trash can entirely empty. Christina had used her spare key, dumped my pills down the drain, and rearranged my sanctuary just to make me question my own memory. I called her, demanding my keys back. That was exactly the reaction she wanted. Christina dragged our mother into my living room an hour later, playing the role of the terrified, heartbroken older sister. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a suffocating, inescapable hug. Her heavy floral perfume burned my throat. She stroked my hair, whispering that I was completely losing my grip on reality. She turned to Mom, crying fake, heavy tears, claiming I was acting paranoid and inventing wild stories about break-ins because I was off my medication. Mom stood by the door, shaking her head in pity, calling me a tragedy. I forced a blank stare, gripping the edge of the kitchen island until my knuckles turned white. Over Christina's shoulder, her phone screen lit up on the counter. Her manicured thumb flew across the glass, sending a text directly to her lawyer. She typed that I was cracking and that they would file the paperwork tomorrow. Her malice was entirely unfiltered, cold, and calculated. She thought she was trapping a helpless victim. She had no idea she was handing a corporate investigator the exact behavioral pattern needed. 2 days later, Christina escalated her game. She brought Dr. Adrian into my living room. He wore a sharp, custom Italian suit that reeked of corporate bribery. The entire evaluation lasted exactly 10 minutes. He never asked about my sleep, my work, or my grief. He simply scribbled on a yellow legal pad, nodded obediently at Christina, and signed a formal psychiatric committal recommendation. He diagnosed me with severe, dangerous paranoia. My mind instantly cataloged the discrepancy. Christina's startup was bleeding cash, and doctors in custom suits do not make house calls for free. She was paying him off with embezzled corporate funds. After the doctor left, Mom walked out to the car. Christina lingered in the hallway. The fake loving sister mask dropped the second the door clicked shut. She stepped right into my personal space, her breath smelling of expensive espresso. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that bounced off the walls. She grabbed my wrist, squeezing it tight, and told me to look at my own pathetic shaking hands. She claimed she was doing me a massive favor. She leaned in close, whispering right into my ear. She said I was a sick animal and she was the pound. She promised that absolutely no one would ever believe me. Mom already thought I was a monster, and a licensed doctor just put my insanity in writing. She smiled, tapping her sharp fingernails against the wall, and stated that my $6,400,000 trust fund was just her rightful compensation for putting up with a psycho. I swallowed the burning bile in my throat and grabbed my phone. I dialed Christina's number later that evening. When the line clicked open, I forced my chest to heave. I let a loud, pathetic sob rattle out of my mouth. I begged her. I played the exact role she built for me, the broken, terrified little sister. I told her I would sign over the entire $6,400,000 trust immediately if she just tore up the psychiatric committal papers. I promised her total financial control. I just asked her to keep me out of the hospital. She swallowed the bait instantly. Christina was running out of time. She had a massive corporate audit scheduled for 8 o'clock the very next morning. Over the last 2 years, she had secretly embezzled $3,600,000 from her own startup's investors to fund her lavish lifestyle. She was drowning in debt. She desperately needed a massive cash injection before those auditors cracked open her ledgers. My trust fund was her only lifeline. Her overwhelming greed and blind panic completely erased her caution. 20 minutes later, the deadbolt clicked. Christina strutted into my living room. Her sharp stiletto heels clicked hard against the hardwood floor. She wore a pristine white trench coat and a cruel, vicious smirk. She tossed her heavy designer bag onto my kitchen counter. She walked right up to where I sat, curled on the sofa. She reached down and patted my cheek, hard. The sharp sting radiated across my jaw. She laughed. The sound was cold and completely devoid of empathy. She stood over me, vibrating with arrogant energy. She simply could not resist the chance to gloat. She paced across the rug and started bragging about her brilliance. She openly admitted she paid Dr. Adrian $30,000 out of a hidden shell company account to forge that insanity diagnosis. She confessed to draining her corporate funds, detailing exactly how she manipulated the wire transfers. She called me a weak, pathetic loser. She called our mother a spineless, gullible fool who would believe absolutely anything just to protect her country club reputation. Christina laid out her entire criminal enterprise word for word, standing right in my living room. I kept my head down, letting my shoulders tremble. I stared at the tips of her expensive leather boots. The contrast was almost intoxicating. She screamed and paraded her false dominance, entirely unaware that the trap had already snapped shut around her ankles. She handed me the shovel, and I was letting her dig her own grave as deep as she possibly could. She thought she had me completely backed into a corner. She thought her victory was absolute. She had absolutely no idea that my attorney Valerie was sitting inside a federal field office 3 miles away. Valerie sat beside 2 senior financial crimes investigators. They stared at a monitor. They watched a crystal-clear, encrypted live video feed capturing every square inch of my living room. I bypassed the technical red tape entirely. There were no hidden wires to trace. One microscopic lens captured it all. Every single arrogant threat. Every detailed financial confession and every cruel insult Christina spat out streamed directly onto a secure federal server. Christina pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from her designer bag and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger at the bottom line. She demanded my signature. She wanted total, unquestioned control over my life and my money. I picked up the stack. My hands were perfectly steady. Over the last 48 hours, I had meticulously reconstructed this exact packet. I kept her pristine cover page, but I completely gutted the interior. The document resting on the glass was not a power of attorney. It was a legally binding confession of fraud and an irrevocable authorization to instantly freeze all corporate and personal assets under her name. I slid the paper back across the table toward her. I looked up, meeting her arrogant glare. I told her the bank required the accepting fiduciary to sign first to establish the chain of custody. It was a basic compliance rule. Her immense greed completely blinded her. She snatched the paperwork. I handed her a heavy, sleek black pen. She clicked the pen, leaned over the table, and slashed her signature across the dotted line. She tossed the pen back onto the glass, laughing. She called me a good, obedient dog. She told me to know my place. She had no idea that the pen contained a micro scanner and a wireless transmitter. The second the ink touched the paper, her exact biometric signature digitized. It fired instantly to a secure server, locking down every single bank account tied to her social security number. A heavy thud echoed through the hallway. The deadbolt splintered. The front door burst wide open, slamming hard against the drywall. Heavy combat boots stomped onto my hardwood floor. My attorney, Valerie, walked in, flanked by 3 federal agents in dark, tactical vests. Christina spun around. Her arrogant smirk vanished. Her phone started screaming. An endless barrage of chimes and aggressive buzzes vibrated across the kitchen counter. Notifications flooded her lock screen. Her offshore accounts, her credit cards, her corporate payroll completely frozen, locked down by the very signature she just provided. Christina lost her mind. The sophisticated chief executive facade shattered into a million pieces. Thick sweat poured down her forehead, smearing her expensive foundation. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. An agent grabbed her wrist. She thrashed backward, kicking her sharp heels into the rug, shrieking at the top of her lungs. She sounded like a cornered animal. Our mother appeared in the open doorway. Erin stood paralyzed, clutching her purse to her chest, watching her golden child scream in federal handcuffs. Christina begged Mom to call somebody to fix it, to use her country club connections. Mom just trembled, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound. I stood up. I walked slowly across the room, stopping inches from my mother's face. I looked straight into her terrified eyes. I told her the absolute truth. You are not a victim, Mom. You are just a coward who chose luxury over your own daughter. The justice system grinds slowly, and Christina knew exactly how to exploit the cracks. She posted a massive temporary bail before her federal indictment hearing. She walked out of holding with a global positioning system monitor strapped to her ankle, but her malice remained completely untouched. Instead of laying low, she decided to burn the entire house down on her way out. She drove straight to our mother's pristine suburban estate. She played the weeping, terrified victim one last time. She begged Mom to unlock her phone, claiming she needed to call a private defense attorney. Mom handed over the unlocked device. In less than 3 minutes, Christina accessed Mom's banking application. She initiated an emergency wire transfer, draining our mother's entire $400,000 retirement fund into an offshore shell company. Then she booked a one-way first-class ticket to Dubai. My phone vibrated violently against my nightstand at 2 o'clock in the morning. The glowing screen illuminated my pitch-black bedroom. It was Mom. I answered the call, and a frantic, hyperventilating sob ripped through the speaker. Mom had just checked her email. The zero balance alert had triggered. She realized her golden child had stripped her completely bare. She faced absolute homelessness. She begged me to save her. I sat up, resting my back against the cold headboard. I took a slow, deep breath. The wire transfer was massive, meaning it sat inside a banking clearinghouse pending morning approval. It had not left United States jurisdiction. I opened my laptop, dialed my direct contact at the Federal Financial Crimes Division, and flagged the routing number. We froze the transaction instantly. At 6 o'clock that morning, Christina stood at the international boarding gate. She wore oversized sunglasses and a cashmere travel coat, clutching her designer leather passport wallet. She stood right in the middle of the priority boarding line, surrounded by wealthy socialites and business executives. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass. The machine flashed a harsh, bright red light. Christina slammed her hand on the counter, demanding respect. She screamed at the agent. Then heavy footsteps echoed behind her. 3 armed federal marshals surrounded her right there in the terminal. They grabbed her wrists, snapping the steel handcuffs shut in front of everyone. They stripped her of her designer bags, seizing her passport. Her entire carefully curated, flawless reputation died right there on the airport carpet. Justice swept through the rest of the board. Dr. Adrian arrived at his private clinic that same morning. He found federal investigators carrying cardboard boxes full of his patient files out the front door. My attorney Valerie stood on his pristine porch, handing him a permanent medical board suspension notice. I listened to my mother weeping through the phone speaker, pleading for a place to stay. I lowered the phone, tapped the red button, and ended the call. The silence filled my room, and for the first time in my entire life, my shoulders felt light. The gavel fell on a cold Tuesday morning in November. The sound echoed across the mahogany walls of the federal courthouse, sealing a fate that could never be undone. Christina stood before the judge, stripped of her designer suits and heavy makeup, wearing a standard-issue tan jumpsuit. The judge did not show a single ounce of mercy. She sentenced my sister to 9 years in state prison for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and perjury. The court also attached a consecutive 3-year sentence for the attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She would not be eligible for a parole hearing for at least 8.5 years. The judge then slammed her with a mandatory restitution order, forcing her to repay the stolen $3,600,000 directly to her defrauded corporate investors. The financial ruin was absolute, but the social execution was far more brutal. For years, Christina and my mother had used the local Charlotte gossip mill to isolate me and build their pristine kingdom. That exact same machine turned on them with terrifying speed. The board of directors at their elite country club held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to revoke both of their memberships, permanently banning them from the grounds. My mother's wealthy friends, the women she had spent decades trying to impress, blocked her phone number and crossed the street when they saw her walking. Without Christina's stolen money funding her lavish lifestyle, the bank foreclosed on the massive suburban estate. My mother was forced to pack her remaining clothes into garbage bags and move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. She became a total ghost in the exact town she used to rule. 7 months later, the changing of the seasons brought a strange envelope to my mailbox. It was a cheap, thin manila envelope stamped with the red ink of a federal correctional facility's mail inspection room. I carried it into my kitchen, dropped it onto the granite counter, and sliced the top open. A single piece of lined yellow notebook paper slid out. The handwriting belonged to Christina. The letter was a masterpiece of toxic manipulation. She did not write a single word of genuine apology. Instead, she tried to play the exact same worn-out chords of guilt and family obligation. She wrote that the prison conditions were horrible. She claimed she only took the money because the pressure to uphold our father's successful legacy had completely shattered her mind. She wrote that we were still blood, that she was still my older sister, and that our mother was growing sick and needed my financial support. She ended the page by demanding I put money into her prison commissary account because family forgives family. Years ago, a letter like that would have triggered a massive panic attack. I would have spent days agonizing over my duty, crying over the broken pieces of my family, wondering if I was the bad guy. This time, my chest remained completely still. My breathing stayed perfectly even. I clamped my jaw shut. I walked over to the home office, fed the yellow paper directly into the metal teeth of the document shredder, and watched her toxic words turn into useless ribbons. I brewed a cup of black tea, sat on my porch, and watched the sunset. True healing requires a completely new environment. You cannot recover in the same house where you were broken. I moved out of that dark, anxious apartment and bought a house with massive glass windows that let the morning light pour across the hardwood floors. I built a life that finally felt safe. My dining room table is no longer a battleground. There are no shattered watches, no screaming matches, and no cruel whispers. I fill those chairs with my chosen family. My attorney Valerie became one of my closest mentors and a staple at my Sunday dinners. I surrounded myself with friends who respect my boundaries, people who never ask me to shrink myself down to make them comfortable. We share heavy plates of roasted vegetables, pour good wine, and fill the room with loud, genuine laughter. When someone drops a fork or spills a glass of water, nobody screams. Nobody throws a punch. We just grab a towel and wipe it up. That is what peace physically feels like. My shoulders finally dropped away from my ears, and I finally sleep through the entire night. I know exactly why you are listening to this story. You are watching this right now because you know this exact kind of pain. You have sat at a dinner table and swallowed your own dignity just to keep the peace. You have watched a toxic sibling or a cruel parent twist the truth, playing the victim while they hold the knife. You have been called crazy, sensitive, or selfish simply because you finally demanded basic human respect. Narcissists and manipulators rely on a very specific playbook. They weaponize your empathy. They know you have a good heart, so they manufacture endless crises to keep you exhausted, off balance, and constantly doubting your own reality. They use the concept of family as a cage, trapping you inside a cycle of abuse by convincing you that setting a boundary is an act of betrayal. It is time to break that cage permanently. I want to give you 3 absolute rules for surviving the people who share your blood. Rule number 1. Blood is a biological fact, not a free pass for abuse. Loyalty must be earned through consistent, respectful behavior. Sharing a last name or a childhood roof does not obligate you to finance someone's greed or absorb their cruelty. If a stranger on the street treated you the way your toxic relative treats you, you would call the police and never speak to them again. Apply that exact same standard to your family tree. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to cut the cord. Rule number 2. Never fight a gaslighter with emotion. Crush them with cold data. When a toxic person realizes they are losing control over you, they will escalate. They will call you hysterical. They will drag in flying monkeys and corrupt enablers to validate their lies. If you scream, cry, or beg them to understand your pain, you are handing them the exact ammunition they need to paint you as the unstable one. Stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Document the abuse, gather the evidence, keep your voice steady, and let the undeniable truth destroy their false narrative. The receipts will always speak louder than their tears. Rule number 3. Forgiving an enabler is just giving them a front row seat to your next abuse. The enabler is often far more dangerous than the primary abuser. My mother watched my sister physically attack me, and she chose to protect her country club reputation over her own daughter's safety. Enablers will demand that you accept the abuse because your silence buys their comfort. They will beg you to be the bigger person because they are too terrified to confront the monster in the room. When you cut off the abuser, you must cut off the enabler too. Keeping them in your life is just leaving the back door wide open for the chaos to return. Recovering your life is not about getting revenge. It is about recovering the absolute right to define your own reality. I took my inheritance, paid my legal fees, and locked the rest away in conservative, secure investments. I still work as a compliance officer, but I no longer work from a place of fear. I work from a place of unbreakable authority. If the people who claim to love you are the same ones holding the knife, what exactly are you trying to save? Do not let shame keep you trapped in a war you did not start. Set the boundary, turn over the evidence, walk out the door, and do not ever look back. I am Jocelyn Evans, and I am finally free. If this story resonated with you, if you have survived the fire of a toxic family, please share your own journey in the comments below. You are not alone, and your voice matters. Subscribe for more stories of surviving the unimaginable and reclaiming your power.